This recording is for the Demography workshop, and what I will present is about the IUD spread in China in the time 1980s to 1990s. And through telling the story of the IUD spread in China at the time, I'm aiming at discussing a conversation among population program, industrial policy, and international relations. It is a historical sociology piece of work. Therefore, it consists of coping with abundant historic data. But before we dive in, it is important to know what we're looking at when we look at the 80s and 90s China. This time spans through both Jiang and Deng's governments, and it's the first 2 decades of the one-child policy. But before the one-child policy, there was another population program campaign called the Later, Longer, Fewer, led by Mao's government, which refers to marry later, have longer birth intervals, and have fewer children. And during the campaign, the total fertility rate actually dropped quite significantly, from 5.8 in 1970 to 2.7 in 1978. Beyond the population program at the time, China was recovering from the trauma resulting from the Cultural Revolution, which caused the country to be in decade-long chaos. Besides, though the Great Chinese Famine happened already around 2 decades ago, the collective memories were still haunted by this disaster, which caused tens of millions of deaths out of starvation. On the other hand, China at the time was also embracing something new, called economic reform and opening up, which means that China opened up for foreign investors and the global trade market since 1978. And because of this opening up policy, the international population NGOs like the UNFPA, of which full name is the United Nations Population Fund, got a chance to work alongside with Chinese government on its population programs. So this is the 1980s and 1990s China. The topic of one-child policy has produced tons of work, and some of them are influential, like the Susan Greenhalgh's Just One Child and John Er's Slaughter of the Innocents, as well as Judith Bannister's China's Changing Population. But why are we still sitting here talking about the one-child policy? For the previous work, they talk extensively on what the one-child policy is, what were the practices, and what kinds of the information that aided Beijing's decision on the one-child policy. And also, demographers talk a lot about China's population changes during the period, including the total fertility rate, the population composition, and the contraceptive prevalence. And more recently, there were works talking about the consequences of the one-child policy. But the story left untold is how industrial policies and also international relations, which at the time being the true focus of China's Communist Party leaders, interplay with the population program in China. And these two things is exactly the focus for my presentation. So, what is a one-child policy? The basic idea for the one-child policy is to assign quotas to every Chinese household. The Chinese couples would allow to have either one child or 2 children, and unauthorized pregnancies often led to unmandated abortion. And in this way, the CCP restrained the population growth of the country. But what we're not mentioned so often is that the one-child policy was actually built on a goal that I would like to call as a 1.2 billion population goal, as the CCP aimed at limiting the country's population to 1.2 billion by the end of the 1990s. And remember what we just discussed about China's attempts in economic reform and the efforts to recover from the Cultural Revolution? It is quite interesting that the CCP took limiting the country's population as one of the approaches to facilitate their plans, since they believed the promising way to revitalize the economy was to double the country's GDP per capita by the end of the 20th century. And to do that, with their calculations, they believed that the population cannot exceed to 1.2 billion by the end of 20th century. So this is how the 1.2 billion came into being. But on the other hand, another influential factor is the theory of the Club of Rome. If you're familiar with Club of Rome, in the 70s, they made this prediction that there would be a population bomb and a worldwide famine in the 80s, which of course triggered China's alarm. So the CCP decided that it should be a good time point for China to search for an appropriate population size, so that China would be no longer vulnerable to large famines. But at the time, China actually knew very little about its population. Because of the Cultural Revolution, the population data have been unreported for a long time, and the most recent census was the 1964 one. And in fact, the CCP did not obtain the data about age-specific fertility rate until the 1982 fertility survey. So at the time, the CCP was quite hesitating to put the one-child policy in place. But here is where the story got interesting. There was a guy called Song Jian, and Song was a missile scientist, have little training in demography. But because of his military science background, he was good at using supercomputers to do estimations and calculations. So starting from 1978, as appointed by the CCP, Song started to do calculations to estimate the numbers about the population at the time. And during the course, he developed a theory called population cybernetics. And this theory refers to that Song believed if the Chinese government get to control the total fertility rate for one generation to 1.5, then not only the population size will be less than 1.2 billion at the end of 1990s, but also China will no longer be vulnerable to large famine because the population size will be more and more compatible to the natural resources held in China. And this is a very strong argument that pushes CCP to put the one-child policy in place. And by this population cybernetic theory, we can tell that China's one-child policy at the beginning was a short-term planning of the TFR. And also, the CCP was aiming at a once-for-all attempt to control its population. And also, because of all the estimated numbers and the not so considerate population calculating model, so the Chinese government bought the whole story of the population cybernetics and adopt various attempts to reach the 1.5 TFR. In the 1995, the government had to confirm that the population size reached 1.22 billion, so that they failed at achieving the goal. But before this point, the Chinese government was very faithful toward Zong's theory. And to make the 1.5 fertility rate really happen, the one-child policy came along with many other civilian techniques. The mandatory fertility control practices were one of the corresponding methods. So beginning 1983, the Chinese government decided to have a national guideline for its population program, which was after first child IUD, after second child sterilization. To have such a guideline means that the Chinese government would ask the married couples to sign contracts with the state, suggesting that they would get on specific contraceptive method based on birth order, and the nonconformity of individuals would result in loss of incentives and may cause unemployment and other kinds of the penalties. Meanwhile, it also means that the cadres of the Chinese government will take the women to the family planning service providers to make sure they get on the assigned population control methods. And because of this practice, there was a high IUD prevalence. So by the end of the 1980s, 41% of all contraceptives used in China were IUDs. And if you're interested, the sterilization consists of 30%. And what is important for us to pay attention to here is that the individuals not only did not have the freedom to get away from getting the IUDs, but also they have little freedom of making the choices about what kinds of the IUDs they got. because the basic practice here was that the local government purchased the IUDs from the state-owned factories that were designated by the central government, and the family planning service providers got the IUDs directly from the local government. So we need to see this as the state made all the family planning and contraceptive choices decisions. Another thing we need to pay attention to is that the state really has the authority in terms of the whole family planning thing. According to the 1982 amendments to the Chinese Constitution, the state controls the whole population planning, and it is the state to see if the population planning is consistent with other plans the government has. So it's quite different from the US, where the individuals have the contraceptive choices they need to make, and also the family planning that they need to do on their own. In China, the two kinds of the choices were all on the government. And after discussing all this background thing, now it's time for us to get into the IUDs. The full name of the IUD is an intrauterine device, which is a long-term contraceptive method. And once an IUD is inserted, it will be effective for around 1 decade. There are 3 generations of the IUD that were widely used in the world population planning programs. The second generation copper T ones and the hormonal ones are quite similar. Both have over 99% of the effectiveness, and both emerged in the 1970s and are both T-shaped and with a string attached to the end, which is designed for IUD removal and examination. Nowadays, scientists are trying to develop a 4th generation IUD, and the second, also the third, are still widely circulated globally. And the WHO still considers the copper T IUD as the most recommended for bulk procurement for the nationwide population programs. But in China at the time, the most circulated IUDs were none of the 3 above. It is a specific design IUD called the stainless steel ring. As shown by the picture here, this IUD is in round shape and has no strings attached. So to remove the IUD, it requires specific tools, as I've also included in the picture. And based on the clinical data, without the specific design tools, about 70% of the SSRs will be difficult to remove. Another difference between the SSRs and the copper T IUD is its low effectiveness. It only has 80% to 90% of the effectiveness. It seems high though, but based on how contraceptive failure is calculated, it means that among 100 women, 10 to 20 women will get pregnant because of the SSR failure. And because of the low effectiveness issue, the Chinese state ordered to stop the manufacturing in the 1993. And the state did not really stop buying SSRs and sending them to the local health service providers until 2005. So this SSR had been used in China for a long time. And as a result, according to the 1992 data, there was about 90% of the IUD users in China were using the SSRs. But interestingly, it is not because that China did not have the copper T IUDs at the time, so that they chose to use the SSRs. So as early as 1976, China had one version of the copper T IUD. And in the following 1 decade, the manufacturing capacity in China in terms of the copper IUD grew quite significantly. The UNFPA donated a few production lines to the government, and beginning 1985, 6 state-owned factories signed manufacturing contract with the UNFPA and were supplying the copper T IUDs to the organization. China also attracted the Western pharmaceutical companies like Schering AG and Organon Corporation to build turnkey factories in China. So as early as 1989, the annual yield of the So as early as 1989, the annual yield of the copper TIUD was over 8 million units and accounted for 20% of the IUD annual production. And at the time, the yearly IUD insertion number in China was around 15 million. So this manufacturing capacity can actually support about a half of the insertions in China at a time. But the fact is, the copper TIUDs were quite negligible in China's population planning story. So where did those more effective copper TIUDs go? Various data sources of mine suggested that almost all the copper TIUDs went to export, including to South America, Africa, Korea, and a large quantity of the IUDs went to supply the UNFPA. Yet, there was a small amount of the copper TIUDs remained domestically, but after tracing them, it turns out that most of them went to the clinical research projects held in China. So the copper TIUDs did not circulate among the ordinary Chinese people at the time. But why this matters? So as suggested by the research led by the Chinese government themselves, 20% to 30% of the women with SSR experience abortions caused by IUD failures. And also by the counterfactual calculation of the UNFPA, that if the Chinese government did not use the SSRs and use the copper TIUDs instead, over 41 million pregnancies and 26 million induced abortions and 9 million live births would reduce over 1 decade. So the effectiveness thing about the IUD can really make a difference. And here comes the puzzle. So it seems that the Chinese government knew some of the things about its low effectiveness SSR, and China had the copper TIUDs along the way, but they chose to export the copper TIUDs instead of using to replace the outdated and less effective ones during the 80s and 90s. So why did the Chinese government choose to do so? A naive view for this is to think that the Chinese government has this simple decision model, and they compare the XYZ contraceptives and the birth control practices. And they had this comparison about the two kinds of the IUDs, and they believed that the SSR is somehow better in terms compared with the copper TIUDs. So they believed that the birth control model was the most appropriate one, and they imposed their decisions to Chinese couples. As I will show you later, there were no decisive reasons making the Chinese government to make such an population program. Instead, there were various payoffs for a diverse group of social actors in the story of the IUD spread in China to make this true trajectory IUD story to become what it is. So instead, to understand the puzzle, I chose an ecological approach. And I borrowed some of the ideas from the linked ecology framework, which was created by Andrew Abbott. And if you're interested, I also linked his paper below. So the basic idea is that there are different ecologies in our society. Even though the actors within the ecologies are quite dependent on each other, they're not fully restrained within the boundaries of the ecologies. Driven by their interests, social actors can work across different ecologies to form alliances with actors from other ecologies. So different ecologies are not isolated from each other. They're interconnected in the social world, and each one serves as a flexible environment for others. Therefore, events within any particular ecology may influence their adjacent ecologies. And for the story of the IUDs, there were 4 major ecologies: couples, state, companies, and NGOs. And the various social actors within the 4 ecologies, because of their mutual interest on the IUD spread in China, formed alliances. And for the four ecologies, they have different characteristics. So for the Chinese couples, their son preference was driving their reproductive behavior. Normally, if the family had a son, they would prefer to delay or even stop expanding their family size. Meanwhile, because children are primarily caregivers to their parents when the parents are old, Chinese parents would worry a lot about their children's capability of taking good care of them in the future, and would tend to expand their family size just to make sure that even if some accidents happen to one of their children, the rest of the children will still be able to take good care of them. And also, individuals have different takes from the one-child policy, and some of them resign to the policy easier. So based on the fertility survey did by the Chinese government in 1981, the peasants normally have the highest fertility rate, which was around 5, while the cadres were lowest, around 2.6. For the state, because of the economic reform, and so the government worked closely with the economic organs globally. And in this way, the government institutions, economic organs, as well as individuals, they all have certain agendas to promote. And to borrow the fragmented authoritarian framework within the state structure, there are different bargains going on, and each of the government units have some agenda to promote. And for the pharmaceutical companies, things are quite profit-driven. There are various benefits for the pharmaceutical companies to outsource in China, especially when it comes to reduce the labor costs. But also because of the technological intensity of the IUD industry, there are certain technological barriers to trade. Also, the IUD industry, like other pharmaceutical sectors, require intensive R&D input and was divided by a small number of companies. So the new joiners were difficult to earn space in the market. As for the international organizations, the primary focus of them is to propagate their vision about population control. Besides of that, developed countries also cared a lot about geopolitics, sustainability, and especially their accessibility to raw materials held by developing countries. Other political groups were also attracted by the birth control movement, including activists for human rights, development, and equality. So as we can see, different actors within different ecological boundaries, they require different payoffs from the spread of the IUDs. And I'm about to show you what were those different payoffs were and what made the story of the IUD spread as it is. But before I talk about my findings, I believe it is important for us to walk through my method. So my method is to cope with various historic materials, both secondary and primary, to find patterns. And I've actually did a rough count about what kinds of the materials I've explored during the course. So it's about 400 pieces of administrative and regulatory documents, about 50 speech records of the relevant senior officials of the Chinese government, and about 40 policy reviews and about 100 conference proceedings, as well as about 100 technical papers of the IUDs and sterilization, and about 60 documents on China's family service provision. And to do triangulation, I chose various data sources, both in language of Chinese and also in English, produced by the researchers from a wide range of countries. But still, there are a few resources that I would want to specify. So when we are looking at the Chinese state data, we question a lot about the data quality, but most of the demographic data were exclusively gathered by the state during the one-child policy period, and including the numbers about the IUD insertion and sterilization. Most of the data were gathered by 1 per 1,000 random sampling method, and it was often the local governments to make the head counting. To some extent, the Chinese government trusts their data, as the Chinese state also used this data to craft their policies. But it is unavoidable that some of the data might be tampered or even falsified, particularly because at the time the central government were expecting the IUD insertion number as well as the sterilization number to increase, and the local governments would get incentives in reporting good numbers. Interestingly, to a look into the procurement number of the IUDs, there is actually a gap between the number of the purchased IUDs and the IUD insertion numbers. Basically, the annual procurement number was around 14 million units, but the annual insertion number was around 15 million. So these numbers need to be triangulated. Another thing I want to talk about is this interesting resource called garbage materials. So the garbage materials did not mean that those materials were not useful. Quite on the contrary, they are invaluable data sources. They are kind of the materials that used to belong to the state-owned institutions, but were sold as waste papers to private vendors who did the paper recycling business. And those vendors would resell the government paperwork rather than just recycle it. So some of the documents contain many confidential contents, and this garbage material may be specific to China's case because I guess it may not be very common for the government institutions to sell the paperwork as waste papers to private vendors. And when I was doing my project, I also got access to some of the internal publications at the time, and also many family service contracts that the individual signed with the states through the trajectory of the garbage materials. And these documents are quite unique and are not disclosed by any of the public sources. And how to find them? There are actually some online vendors selling garbage materials, and they often call themselves as a second-hand bookstore or the private collectors, and this is how I located them. In addition, there is a resource that might be very controversial that I use in my research paper. There are memos of the Chinese former officials, and to be honest, they are published in China and they are open for public. So there should be a lot of political interest embedded in them. And the authors may try to will or alter a lot of things in their writings to achieve their political agendas. But still, I used two of the memos that were written at a particular time point, mainly when the central government decided to make a great turn in terms of their policy, so that the writers did not have to only say about the positive sides of the policies. So I chose one about the economic reform and opening up that were writing when China was trying to be more selective and more cautious about the foreign investors. And I also chose a memo about the one-child policy that was published when the Chinese government announced to officially sway away from the one-child policy. And I also triangulated all of the data that I've retrieved from those controversial data sources. Now, getting back to my findings. So, what is actually the story of China's IUDs? Because China had a policy to promote IUD spread in China, there was a significant IUD prevalence in the country. But actually, what I found is, at the time, China was not aiming to promote the IUD as its primary approach to control the fertility of the Chinese couples. Actually, the method that were emphasized by the Chinese government were abortion and sterilization. And there was a numerical goal for sterilization, which was that 96 million married couples under age 40 should be sterilized. As a result, as we can see here in the diagram, that the number of the abortions and sterilizations always exceeded the numbers of the IUD implants during the period in China. But it was not necessary to think that the IUD was not there. Remember, we're talking about 40% of the IUD prevalence in China. But what role actually is the IUD playing? To look at the state's attitude, the first thing came up out of all the documents was that the SSRs are cheap. Manufacturing cost was less than 1 Chinese penny per unit, while the copper T cost more than 1 Chinese yuan each. As for abortion and sterilization, each surgery would cost around 15 Chinese yuan per person, and the expenses were all on the governments, and the individuals did not have to pay them. Another thing that the state paid attention to was the couple's reactions. Through the lessons that the Chinese government learned from their practices, there was serious violence caused by mandated sterilization and abortions, whereas Chinese couples acted moderately toward the IUD insertion. Which is quite understandable because the Chinese parents rely on their children as their primary caregiver in their old age, and they do not want to be left in the vulnerable position that they will no longer be able to reproduce when they need to. So they will act drastically toward the mandated sterilization. And there were cases reported to the central government that the family planning cadres were stabbed blind, and also many of these peasants threatened the cadres with suicide. So for the IUDs that can be taken off to resume the fertility of the women quickly, since were more acceptable for the Chinese peasant. And also, the IUD insertions were easier for the government to practice. While the sterilization and abortion would definitely need gynecologists, the IUD insertions would not. Skilled family planning workers with a little bit of training can do the insertion. And at the time, the gynecologists were a very scarce resource at China. It was said that in mountainous area, where no gynecologists located, people who wanted to get sterilization would need to report to the local government and wait for the gynecologist to come. Besides, because the SSR did not have the strings attached, it is hard to remove without the government's consent, so that the government would have a better control. So the government cared about these many things, but what I found is that they did not care so much about the effectiveness of the SSRs. They knew the problem in the mid-70s. They mentioned the problems at various venues, and they explicitly said that the SSR's effectiveness is unsatisfying. But in the 80s, when the state funded 200 research institutions to study the IUDs, only a small number of the sponsored projects were about to improve the SSR effectiveness. Most of them went to study the lifespan of the SSRs. So the state kind of had the intuition that the longevity of the SSRs would matter, but they did not think of the individual cases of the SSR failure as something big. So as we can see here, the SSR seemed to be good enough for the state's population program at the time, because they are paying more attention to the sterilization and abortion practices, and the state only include the IUDs because it serves as a good alternative for the sterilization, and also because it's more acceptable for the Chinese people. And also, it is easier for the government because of the limited resource of gynecologists. And there were documents suggesting that the Chinese government did aiming at using sterilization to replace all the IUD insertion one day when they have more gynecologist resources, and when the people have a shift in their attitude towards sterilization. And this was highly compatible with their consideration about a short-term fertility manipulation, that they want to make this TFR to 1.5 as soon as possible and once for all. So for the population program, the payoff of the IUD was that it served as an expediency and an alternative for the government to control the fertility of its people. And besides of China's IUD spreads payoff in the population program, there were also payoffs that generated by the IUD in the aspects of China's industrial policy. So for China, the technologies of the copper T IUDs flew to the countries quite spontaneously. The international organizations and Western pharmaceutical companies established or even donated their advanced production lines of IUDs to China, and also provide new IUD products to China for clinical trials during the 80s and 90s. And we're about to see that as an effective rhetoric tool, the government's interest in IUD brought great opportunities for the country. So UNFPA was one of the main sources for China to get the new IUD technologies and production lines. Though it is a conventional practice that the UNFPA donates some copper T production lines to the countries that they choose to support, based on their mission on increase the developing countries' accessibility to modern contraceptives. But it is unconventional that the UNFPA decided to do outsourcing and establish 6 turnkey factories in China to manufacture the copper T IUDs for the organization. And also, it is unconventional for the UNFPA to establish 2 national IUD research center in China. Oh, sorry. So why they did this is quite understandable. At the time, the UNFPA as well as the WHO wanted to have more clinical data about the second generation IUDs since they wanted to promote the usage of 2 certain kinds of the IUDs. So what they need is an easily available and controllable research population for the field trial and a sustainable supply of the copper T IUDs. And 1/3 of the UNFPA-sponsored IUD clinical trials were conducted in China in such way. Another significant technological transfer resource of the advanced IUD was some of the leading IUD manufacturers of the West. In the 70s, there were actually quite a lot of new inventions in terms of the second generation IUDs and even third generation IUDs because of the prosperous IUD market. But unfortunately, many of the IUDs like the TCU 388 did not get a chance to hit the market before the 1983 Duncan Shell crisis. And that issue caused a global trust crisis over the whole IUD enterprise. So what happened? The Duncan shell is an IUD that's shaped like the picture that I've attached to the slides. And because of the material of the strings attached to it, the Duncan shell caused a lot of women to get pelvic inflammation. As a result, many of the IUDs were taken out of the market, and those IUDs didn't hit the market, were reserved and waiting for further clinical experiment data to prove its safety. But because of the Duncan shell crisis, many of the countries no longer welcome the clinical experiments of the IUDs, except for China, where the government demonstrated great interest in IUDs. So many new IUDs, including the ones that the WHO and the UNFPA are quite interested in, went to China for clinical trials. And it is undoubtedly that China at the time was quite hospitable location for those clinical trials because the government's specific interest in IUDs. But the more difficult question here is why China chose to let them to do so. Especially China did not have the interest in introducing new kinds of the IUDs to its domestic population program. To understand this, it is necessary for us to take a look into China's industrial policy at the time. So starting from 1978, the CCP leaders went to visit Western Europe and Japan, and those visits directed the CCP's attention to a certain kind of high-tech economy that manufactured the advanced products with computerized and robotic-sized production lines. So for China, anything that is about the modern production line would fascinate them, including the production lines of the second generation IUDs. So China was quite glad about the modern production lines that the UNFPA as well as the Western pharmaceutical companies established in China. Needless to say that some of the production lines were donations from the UNFPA. On the other hand, given the lucrative and big IUD market, China also wanted to take a share of the pie. But China's IUD industry was far behind the global trend, and there existed a technological barrier to trade. Many of the companies, especially the pharmaceutical companies, will only transfer the technologies with little added technological value. So what was smart about the Chinese government was that they used the government's interest in population planning and IUDs to visit the countries where the leading IUD manufacturers located in. For example, since 1984, the CCP started to show interest in the Dutch IUD company called Organon. And what the Chinese government did is to send delegations to visit Netherlands as well as the manufacturing facilities of Organon for several times. And when the Netherlands government finally showed interest in cooperating with the Chinese government on its population program in 1987, the Chinese government delegation successfully including Organon into the whole discussion and had Organon to sign a contract with the Chinese Family Planning Commission on IUD co-manufacture. So as we can see here, the Chinese government was quite Machiavellian, and by doing so, China actually got to attract not only a few advanced IUD production lines, but also tens of millions of US dollars as FDI from those Western pharmaceutical companies. But the payoffs in China's industry were more than the 2 points that I've mentioned above. So during the time, because of China's fascination about the modern production line, China entered a phase called buying modernization, that China signed thousands of contracts with the Western countries to purchase a wide range of manufacturing facilities, which costed the government billions of US dollars. So China's foreign exchange reserve was quickly dried out. At the year end of 1978, there were only $167 million remaining in the foreign exchange reserve of China, while there were numerous outstanding final payments of the manufacturing facilities left unpaid. So in order to resume its foreign exchange reserve, China had this policy called 三来一补, in which 三来meant that the foreign business should supply China with three things, including the production model, the raw materials, and the manufacturing equipment, while 一补 suggested that the business should simply require to cover the labor costs in China. And this was quite attractive for the UNFPA as well as the Western IUD manufacturers. And so far, we've discussed various payoffs centering around both population program and industrial policy, and these have made sense of many aspects of the IUD spread. But what we haven't discussed was the political interest in the international relations that were ubiquitous in the story of China's IUD. So it's quite easy to find the mediation on the Western society on China's population program. There were all kinds of the drama there, and each of them may able to serve as a whole new topic for new dissertation. So what I'm going to do here is just to list them out. So for the NGOs like Ford Foundation, UNFPA, and WHO, their mission in China was kind of to lobby a certain type of population control practices, which specifically direct to the adoption of the IUDs. And it was also them who were dealing with the human rights people and making negotiations. And for Japan, the country started to pay attention to the population program very early. And it is interesting that the country kind of borrowed 40 counties from China to practice various population management techniques from 1984 to 2004. It is called the IP project, which of the full name is International Partnership Project. And to my knowledge, there haven't had any literature about the details about this part of the story. And besides of direct intervention, there were many other institutions that were pure observers of these strategic social experiments, like the US Census Bureau. So they paid a lot of attention to the practices that China used in fertility control. And they are not disinterested though. They observe for specific purposes, and many of the institutions showed interest in knowing what was effective and what was not for a population program, so to expand their toolkits. There were also political movements that used China as a counterexample to support their arguments that the state should not have intervention on people's reproductive behaviors, like the New Rights Movement in the US. That is, as a drastic social experiment, China's fertility control practices were studied by the global society from many different aspects. Another way around, because China was being eager to actively involve in population control issue and to take more sophisticated and constructive stance toward regional and global affairs. The spread of IUD somehow helped the Chinese government to get some global recognition. For example, the official who proposed the whole idea about the IUD policy called Qian Xingzhong got the first United Nations Population Award in 1983, and I've listed his picture on this slide. And also because of China's actively involvement in the clinical research and manufacture of the IUDs, China has become one of the countries that helped to make the manufacturing standard of the TCU 388, which is still in use nowadays. And also, by actively participating in population issues, China was able to cooperate with the regional organizations like APEC, even before China became a member of the organization. So as we can see, those different ecologies have hosted a conversation among population program, industrial policy, and international relations. And such a conversation demonstrated that even with one policy, that country could get various payoffs from multiple aspects. Yet such a story came to an end around the mid-90s. As a fail of the 1.2 billion goal taken the Chinese government to pay more attention to the long-term population planning instead of the short-term fertility manipulation. Also, in the 1994, the United Nations specifically highlighted that the focus of the population program should shift from the controlling population growth to an emphasis on reproductive rights and reproductive health. So mandated use of contraceptives would no longer generate positive global image for the Chinese state. And also, starting from the late 90s, there were more facilities of the IUD manufacturers were established in China, and some Chinese private-owned IUD companies emerged. So that the manufacturing capacity of the copper T became sufficient enough to support both the domestic and the global market, and so that the SSR started to fade away. Therefore, here comes the end of the true trajectory IUD story. But the story lasted for 22 years, and based on my juvenile calculation based on UNFPA's counterfactual calculation, it was about 90 million cases of IUD failure. So in summary, for the story of the IUD spread, we can see the different ecologies affect each other and their interaction generated various payoffs. And I'm still working on this framework, so there are many things we've discussed but not included into this framework. But the basic idea is, though none of the payoffs were significant enough to make a decisive move for the government, those benefits that work across different ecologies actually make significant difference and comprising the whole story of the IUD spread in the 80s and 90s China. Meanwhile, what is interesting is how the industrial policy can affect the IUD spread in China in this unexpected way. So it is certainly not a bad idea for us to look beyond the population policy from time to time when we study the population programs in different regions. And this will be the end of my presentation. And thank you for listening.